The deep end. It was a still, moonless night when Avery Crawford drove into Pine Hill, a small town hidden deep within the forests of upstate New York. The trees, tall and imposing, loomed over the winding road, creating a tunnel-like path that seemed to swallow her car whole. Avery wasn't the type to scare easily, but something about Pine Hill felt unsettling from the moment she crossed its border. She'd come for peace and quiet, an escape from the chaos of New York City. A freelance writer, she figured that a week in a remote cabin would help her finish her latest novel. But as she passed through the nearly deserted town square, a strange unease crept up her spine. Pine Hill was a ghost town, its buildings old and crumbling, with not a soul in sight. Even the gas station seemed abandoned, though the pumps were still operational. Avery tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to her city girl nerves, and continued toward the cabin she had rented online. It was a quaint place, small but cozy, nestled near the edge of a large lake. The water was so still, it could have been a sheet of glass, reflecting the dense forest on the other side. The realtor had boasted about the lake being the best part of the property, but as Avery stood on the dock and stared into its inky depths, she felt anything but peaceful. The water was too dark, too quiet, and there was an eerie stillness in the air, as though the entire area held its breath, waiting for something to happen. She shook her head, laughing at her own paranoia. "It's just water," she muttered, turning away from the lake and heading back into the cabin. The evening passed without incident. Avery unpacked her things, set up her laptop on the small wooden desk by the window, and made herself a simple dinner of canned soup and bread. She was exhausted from the drive, so after a quick shower, she crawled into bed and fell asleep almost immediately. At first, it was just a dream. Avery found herself standing on the dock again, staring into the black water. Only this time, the water wasn't still. It rippled, small waves lapping at the shore. Something was moving beneath the surface, dark and sinuous, like a shadow twisting and turning just out of sight. Avery felt a strange pull, a compulsion to step closer, to lean over the edge and look deeper. Her heart raced, but her body moved on its own, inching toward the water. And then she saw it. A hand, pale and bloated. It reached out from the depths, its fingers curling toward her, as if beckoning her to come closer. Avery wanted to scream, but her throat closed up. She couldn't move. The hand grew closer, breaking through the surface of the water, followed by an arm, then a shoulder, then a face. The face was twisted and grotesque, waterlogged and swollen, with eyes that bulged unnaturally from their sockets. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, and Avery finally found her voice. She screamed too, a high-pitched wail that echoed across the lake. But the creature kept coming, pulling itself out of the water and onto the dock. Just as the creature's hand reached for her, Avery jolted awake, gasping for breath. Her heart thundered in her chest, her body drenched in cold sweat. She sat up, clutching the blankets to her chest as she tried to steady her breathing. "It was just a dream," she whispered to herself. "Just a stupid dream." But as she glanced toward the window, her breath caught in her throat. The lake, visible from her bedroom, was no longer still. Small ripples spread across its surface, as if something had disturbed the water. Avery froze, her mind racing. It couldn't be real. It had to be a coincidence, a trick of the light. But the ripples grew larger, spreading farther across the lake. And then for just a moment, she saw it, a pale hand, barely breaking the surface, before disappearing again beneath the waves. The next morning, Avery couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself that it was just a dream, that the ripples in the lake were caused by fish or wind or some other perfectly reasonable explanation. But every time she looked out at the water, she felt that same creeping unease, as if something was watching her from below. She forced herself to focus on her work, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind kept drifting back to the dream, to the hand reaching for her, to the face that haunted her every time she closed her eyes. By midday, she'd given up on writing altogether and decided to explore the town instead. Pine Hill was as empty as it had been the night before. The few people she did see barely acknowledged her presence, their faces blank and expressionless. Avery stopped at the diner for lunch, but the food was bland, and the waitress didn't so much as glance in her direction after taking her order. It was as though the whole town was caught in some kind of trance, going through the motions of life without actually living it. On her way back to the cabin, Avery stopped by the local library. It was a small, musty building with shelves full of books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The librarian, an elderly woman with thinning gray hair, peered at Avery over the rims of her glasses as she entered. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice low and raspy. Avery hesitated, unsure of how to explain what she was looking for. "I was wondering if you had any books on local legends or folklore, anything about the lake near the old cabins." The librarian's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Avery thought she wouldn't answer. But then the woman stood, moving slowly toward the back of the library. "We don't get many people asking about the lake," she said, as she led Avery to a dusty corner filled with old, leather-bound volumes. "But there are a few stories. Most folks around here don't like to talk about it, though." "Why not?" Avery asked, her curiosity piqued. The librarian glanced at her, a flicker of something, fear perhaps, crossing her face. "They say the lake is cursed, that something lives in the water, something that pulls people under. Folks disappear sometimes, and their bodies are never found. Some think it's just an old wives' tale, but..." She trailed off, her gaze drifting toward the window. "But others believe it's real." Avery shivered, remembering the hand from her dream. "What kind of something?" The librarian shook her head. "No one knows for sure. Some say it's the ghost of a woman who drowned in the lake 100 years ago. Others say it's a creature, something ancient and evil, that's been there since before the town was founded." Avery nodded, though her mind was already racing. She thanked the librarian and took a few of the old books with her, determined to find out more. But as she walked back to her cabin, the oppressive silence of the town weighed on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was watching her from the shadows. That night, the dreams returned. Avery was back on the dock, staring into the black water. This time, she wasn't alone. She could see figures moving beneath the surface, their pale faces floating just below the waterline. They were reaching for her, their hands outstretched, their mouths open in silent screams. But Avery couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the spot, her body frozen as the figures drew closer. The water lapped at her ankles, cold and slimy, and she realized with horror that the dock was sinking, pulling her down with it. "No," she whispered, struggling to break free. "No, please." But it was too late. The water closed over her head, and she was sinking, the cold blackness swallowing her whole. The figures circled around her, their faces twisted and grotesque, their hands grabbing at her, pulling her deeper. She woke with a start, gasping for air. Her heart pounded in her chest, her body slick with sweat. She sat up trembling and glanced toward the window. The lake was calm again, but Avery knew better. Something was out there. Something was waiting. The next few days passed in a blur of fear and sleeplessness. Avery couldn't concentrate on her writing, couldn't shake the nightmares that plagued her every time she closed her eyes. She tried to avoid the lake, but it was impossible. It was always there, lurking just outside her window, its dark waters beckoning her closer. She tried to leave, to pack up and drive back to the city, but every time she got in her car, something stopped her. It was as though the town itself wouldn't let her go, as though the lake had its hooks in her and wouldn't release her until it was done. One night, after yet another sleepless evening of tossing and turning, Avery found herself standing on the dock again. This time, she wasn't dreaming. The cool night air brushed against her skin. The sound of the water lapping gently at the shore filled the silence. She didn't know why she had come out there, why her feet had carried her to the dock, despite the fear that gripped her. But as she stood there, staring into the lake, she realized with a sickening certainty that she wasn't alone. The water rippled, small waves spreading out from the center of the lake.